Welcome to Lo-Fi Stories. I'm Harry, your quiet guide through tonight's mystery. Before we begin, take a slow breath in, and gently let it out. Let the day slip away, and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let's begin. Some crimes are not buried by time, but by silence. And in the narrow alleys of Bell Lane, silence once screamed louder than murder. There is a street in the oldest part of London where the light dies first. It is not marked boldly on modern maps, and even the cabmen hesitate to pass through after dark. A crooked vein that runs east of Aldgate, Bell Lane lives folded in shadows, where time slows and memories rot. Fog comes heavier there. Footsteps stretch longer. Even the wind seems to hold its breath, as if afraid of waking something that never quite slept. And it was there, on a night when the moon was smothered and the gas lamps whispered, that an old butcher's shop revealed what it had been hiding for decades. The sign above the window read Farrell and Sons, purveyors of fine meats. The wood was split, the lettering nearly vanished, yet the door had not creaked in years. Or so they thought. When the constables entered, drawn by the scent of something too old to be fresh, they did not expect to find a man on the slab. Nor did they expect to see him dressed in a butcher's apron, lips sewn shut with twine, and his hands placed gently over his chest as if in prayer. There was no blood. No signs of struggle. Only a single message scratched into the cracked plaster of the wall behind him. I never left. They called Scotland Yard. And Scotland Yard, burdened by the taste of old dread, sent for the only man whose name stirred fear in murder's spine. In those years, Holmes had grown quieter. Not slower, never that, but deeper, like a river whose current pulled beneath the surface. He didn't chase crimes anymore. He listened for the ones that whispered. And when Bell Lane whispered, it came with an echo too loud to ignore. The Yard brought him the name, the Bell Lane Butcher. Not one of notoriety. Not like the Ripper. The Ripper made headlines. The Butcher made none. For he was never caught, never questioned, and most curiously, never spoken of. 5 victims in 1873. All found inside the same butcher's shop. All posed. All silent. The shop was sealed. The case was buried. Not solved. Not mourned. Just erased. There was a name attached to the shop, Thomas Farrell, but no grave, no record of escape, no official death. Only a shuttered building and the scent of rotting memory. So when a new body surfaced, with the same markings, the same ritual, and the same eerie stillness, it was not a resurrection. It was a continuation. The shop had not aged well. Dust coated every surface like a second skin. The walls sagged with damp and despair. But something within it remained unchanged, the air. Thick. Metallic. Like breath held too long. The body on the slab was unfamiliar. A stranger. No identification. But what chilled the Yard wasn't who the man was, it was what he wore. An apron. Neatly tied. Freshly laundered. Impossible, for a building untouched in 20 years. Yet there it was. And behind him, the words again. I never left. There was no door forced open. No window disturbed. No prints. Just presence. And then, the second body appeared. Not in Bell Lane, but in a flat in Limehouse. A woman this time. Young. Unrelated. But sewn the same way. Dressed the same way. Arranged with the same care. No message on her body, but one etched above her doorframe. Again. I never left. Witnesses saw a figure. Tall. Wearing an apron. standing still in the mist before vanishing into the haze. No sound. No footprints. Just a shape. It was as though Bell Lane had learned to walk. Scotland Yard panicked quietly. The press kept at bay. But whispers leaked, like water through old brick. And the whispers grew teeth. Because people remembered. Not the details. But the fear. Thomas Farrell had once worked not as a butcher, but as a pathologist. A surgeon cast out for unauthorized dissections. Men said he had a hunger for understanding the human form that bordered on obsession. When he lost his license, he vanished into Bell Lane and reappeared as something else. A purveyor of flesh. He opened the butcher's shop with no sons, no staff, and no neighbors willing to step too close. Deliveries came, but never left. Lights flickered after midnight. Sounds, cleaver-like, wet and sharp, echoed long into the hours when only rats still walked. And then came the bodies. 5 in 6 months. But the city was already bleeding then, from plague, poverty, and the ghosts of the Ripper. So the yard silenced the tale. Covered it in ink and dust. Told themselves it had ended when Farrell disappeared. But what if it hadn't? What if it was never Farrell? What if something far colder, far older, had simply borrowed his name? The case files were thin, too thin. Pages missing. Names redacted. Statements unsigned. One note, scribbled and left in a sealed folder, read only. Not human. Not sane. Burns everything. Don't open the shop again. Ever. But the shop had been opened. Therefore, something had stepped out. Some say evil dies. Others say it sleeps. But in Bell Lane, evil was patient. It waited not for opportunity, but for memory to fade. For time to wrap the crime in forgetfulness. And then it returned, not like thunder, but like a whisper. Soft. Methodical. Unhurried. Each new victim was not a mistake, not an accident, not even a choice. They were pieces. Pieces in a ritual. But no one knew what that ritual was. Not yet. The city moved on, as it always does. Bells rang. Markets bustled. Policemen marched in polished boots while fog curled up around their heels. But deep in the bones of Bell Lane, something stirred. The slab had been cleaned. The twine prepared. The butcher's apron hung once more, ready to be worn. And from the cracked wall, the words had begun to glow faintly under moonlight, as if etched not in chalk, but in bone. I never left. That night, the fog rolled in earlier than usual. And on Bell Lane, beneath the same crumbling eaves that once whispered over Farrell's butcher shop, a man was found standing at the edge of the vanished alley. Barefoot. Dressed in rags. Covered in soot. Silent. When spoken to, he did not answer. When questioned, he stared blankly at the bricks. And when an officer touched his shoulder, the man collapsed, wordless, weightless, like an empty coat filled with ash. He was not dead. Not yet. But his mind was no longer his own. At the infirmary, he was given a bed and warm broth, though neither seemed to reach him. Doctors called it shock. But when a nurse attempted to wash his hands, she found something chilling. Burns. Long, vertical burns, one on each palm, as though he had grasped red-hot iron bars. And between his fingers, bits of torn paper. Holmes was summoned before dawn. He examined the man without words, his movements quiet, reverent, like a priest in a forgotten chapel. The paper fragments were gently pulled from the man's grasp. They were brittle, scorched at the edges. ink smeared by soot. Only a few words were legible, but enough to make Holmes' eyes narrow in thought. Removal from cellar, not ordinary remains, skin preserved. And at the bottom corner, half a signature still visible. Arel. The paper came from a journal. And not just any journal, but Thomas Farrell's. Therefore, the man had either found it or stolen it. But how? And from where? The cellar. That word, cellar, was the first true direction in the case. Because no cellar had ever been listed in the shop's blueprints. And yet, the journal mentioned something beneath. And if there was a beneath, then Bell Lane's buried secret might be deeper, literally, than anyone had dared assume. Holmes requested the shop be reopened. Not just the ground floor. The foundation. After much hesitation, the yard obliged. What they found was not a cellar. It was a crypt. The butcher's floor had a loose stone, concealed beneath a molding table long rotted through. When pried open, it revealed a narrow staircase, descending not into stone, but into clay. Wet, red, and foul. There was no lamp down there. Only darkness. And something worse than darkness. Silence. It was not an ordinary basement. It had no shelves. No meat hooks. No ice bins. It had murals. Crude carvings etched into the clay walls. Rows upon rows of humanoid figures, drawn with trembling hands. Each wore an apron. Each held a cleaver. And each had no face. On the far end of the chamber, a slab of stone, shaped like a butcher's block, stood untouched by time. And resting upon it, something far older than the crimes. Bones. But not full skeletons. Fragments. Each one wrapped in parchment. Each one marked with a number and a name. Names that did not match any known victim. There was a box in the far corner. Locked. Holmes picked it open. Inside, a collection of wax cylinders, early audio recordings, labeled only with years. Dozens of them. The yard had no equipment capable of playing them, but the museum did. Therefore, Holmes and the inspector carried the box to a hidden room beneath the British Museum, where old voices slept on wax and wire. The first recording crackled, hissed, and then played. October 13th, entry number 1. This is Dr. Farrell. I record this not for confession, but for remembrance. For what the city will not remember, I must preserve. They are changing. The skin does not decay. The eyes do not close. And the hearts, God forgive me, they beat. The wax fell silent. No one spoke for some time. And yet, something in the chamber seemed to grow colder. That was the first tape. There were over 50 more. And with each one, Farrell's voice changed. Became more frantic. More ragged. Less a surgeon, more a man slipping into belief. Into obsession. Or worse, into fear. Therefore, the cellar beneath the butcher's shop was not storage. It was a vault. A place not built to hold food. But to contain something. Something Farrell had tried to bury. Back at the infirmary, the soot-covered man woke from his silence. His first words were whispered. Not to the nurse. Not to the doctor. But to no one. He's not gone. He just changed his name. The nurse asked him to repeat it. He did not respond. He simply began to hum. A lullaby. The same one Mrs. Adela Rowe had remembered hearing in her nursery window nearly 60 years ago. Holmes returned to the cellar one final time that night. He stood alone beneath the butcher shop, listening. And though no sound stirred, he felt something. Watching. Waiting. As if the ground beneath his feet was not finished yet. And scrawled on the wall now, where no words had been before, were 5 fresh lines, written in soot. They named me wrong. I wore no mask. I carved to remember. You carved to forget. But I never left. The voice of Thomas Farrell echoed long after the wax cylinder had ceased to spin. It lingered in the stale air of the museum vault, clinging to the ribs of the men who had listened. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Not the voice of a man confessing his sins. Nor the voice of a killer seeking forgiveness. It was the voice of a man trying to remember something the world had tried to erase, and fearing that in the remembering, he might bring it back. The second wax cylinder began with a click. Then static. Then silence. Then, a breath. October 20th. The second week. I have not slept. They told me to close the shop. Said I wasn't well. But I know what I saw. Farrell's voice shook, faint, disjointed. The bones are too clean. Too warm. They hum when the candles go out. There's something wrong with the marrow. It's still alive. Then a pause. Then a whisper. They're not mine anymore. And then, a sound. At first it seemed like background noise, or the cylinder's degradation. But it wasn't. It was rhythmic. Wet. As though something behind the voice was cutting through flesh. Slowly. Lovingly. Holmes said nothing. He only reached for the third cylinder. And when it played, it was no longer a journal. It was a conversation. But only one voice was human. Tell me your name, Farrell said. I am you, replied the other. No, you're not. I didn't ask for this. But you carved. You touched. You opened the door. You're inside me. You let me in. The voices overlapped. One tired. One eager. One trembling. One thrilled. Then both said together. We never left. The final minute of the third tape was silence. But not stillness. A low pulse thrummed beneath it. Almost imperceptible. A vibration. Holmes replayed it on high-sensitivity instruments. What he found chilled even the engineers. The vibrations created a pattern. A sound wave in the shape of a sigil, an archaic spiral resembling an ancient surgical rune from Mesopotamian folklore. A symbol of cutting not just the body, but memory. Therefore, this was no ordinary madness. This was ritualized erasure. A method of cutting memory from history. And Farrell, perhaps unwillingly, had been its vessel. Outside the vault, London spun on, unaware. But down in Whitechapel, something stirred again. Another body was found. This time, a boy. No more than 16. Laid across the same butcher's slab. Same twine-bound lips. Same apron. But this time, the eyes were not removed. They were propped open. Staring. As though forced to witness something beyond his final breath. And scrawled on the boy's chest, written in red chalk. Do you see yet? The Yard attempted to withhold the discovery from the public. But rumors do not respect chains. They flow like blood. A local chimney sweep claimed to have seen a man walking Bell Lane just before dawn. Not just walking, gliding, as though his feet did not quite touch the ground. He wore an apron. Not stained, but pressed. Clean. Crisp. And his face? He had no face at all, sir. just smooth skin. Like a candle that had melted and healed itself. The constable who took the statement laughed. But he laughed a little too quickly. Holmes, that evening, returned to the shop. Not to investigate. Not to gather clues. But to listen. And listen he did. The building creaked. Not with wind. But with memory. He paced its wooden frame in darkness, each footstep met with whispers, inaudible to most ears, but not to his. Because Holmes was not just a seeker of facts. He was a seeker of forgotten patterns. And as the wind rose, he whispered aloud. There are 3 voices in the wax. The surgeon. The echo. And the thing in between. He turned to the slab, where the boy's body had been removed only hours earlier. And there, beneath a thin layer of dried blood, he saw it. A pattern in the wood grain. Not random. Not damage. Carved by hand. A spiral. The same sigil as the wax cylinder. Holmes reached for chalk and copied it in silence. And as he did, he noticed something more. A name had been scratched beneath the symbol. Not Farrell. Not a victim. A single word, etched with slow, angry precision. Memory. That night, the remaining wax cylinders were sealed under guard. Locked beneath reinforced glass in a museum vault that had not been opened in 30 years. But not before one last was played. This cylinder was undated. Its label scratched off. And it contained only 4 words. Spoken in a voice not quite Farrell's. Not quite human. Bring the apron back. Then silence. Far across the city, a fire broke out. Not in a home. Not in a shop. But in the old archives of the Metropolitan Morgue. Specifically, Section D. The division responsible for body records between 1873 and 1875. By morning, nothing remained but ash. Every record of the original victims. Gone. But not erased. No. This was no cleansing. This was a harvest. And as the smoke curled through London's eastern sky, a child passing through Bell Lane looked up at the broken butcher's window and froze. For there, hanging just behind the fractured glass, was an apron. Pressed. Folded. Waiting. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air remained thick with moisture, as if the very street exhaled memories too heavy to carry. The faint glisten on Bell Lane's cobbles reflected the gray skies above, but beneath them stirred something older than the rain, something buried. Sherlock Holmes arrived at the scene before the hour of 10. His coat flared as he stepped out of the hansom cab, and his gaze swept the facade of number 9 like a surgeon inspecting flesh for bruises beneath the skin. Bell Lane was unnaturally quiet, though not from respect. It was the hush of watchfulness, of people listening from behind curtains and cracked shutters. I do not like the smell of this house, Holmes muttered, his cane tapping once against the doorstep. Watson followed him in, ducking under the low threshold. The smell hit them both at once, a mixture of earth, rust, and something that faintly resembled lye. The drawing-room remained untouched, but Holmes walked past it as though it were an irrelevant page in a book he had already read. He paused at the door to the cellar. "This is where it begins," he said softly. Watson blinked. "Not ends?" "No," Holmes replied. "Not ends. Because nothing ends before it festers." He knelt by the edge of the cellar door and inspected the iron latch. It was old and pocked with rust. But the hinges, freshly oiled. They gleamed like wet beetle shells. "Someone has been coming down here," Holmes said, almost as if to himself. "Often. Recently. And carefully. He opened the door slowly, without a creak. The stairwell descended in a narrow spiral of old stone. A lantern hung on the wall by a nail, its glass speckled with soot. Watson took it, and they began the descent together. The air grew colder, inch by inch. The temperature dipped as though they were moving not into a cellar but a mausoleum. Each step downward seemed to thicken the air, and by the time they reached the floor, Watson could see his breath. The room opened into a low, wide cavern of stone and mortar. At first glance, it was unremarkable. Boxes of potatoes. A rusted meat hook. Shelves with dry preserves. But Holmes didn't look at these. His gaze moved to the wall. "See the marks?" he asked. Watson followed his eyes. Scratches. Faint, but deliberate. 4 vertical lines with a single one crossing through them, a tally, repeated again and again in a long, sweeping curve along the brick wall. "Count them," Holmes said. Watson did. 116. Holmes nodded. But what could it mean? Holmes turned and picked up a small shard of bone from the ground. It was smooth, bleached white, and broken cleanly. Then he pointed to a pile in the corner. Bones. Small ones. Not human, Watson hoped, but that hope was fleeting. Holmes didn't speak. He paced to a wooden barrel that had once held brine or vinegar. He pried it open with his cane. Watson leaned in, then flinched backward. Within lay neatly folded parchment paper. Blood-stained. Underneath, the unmistakable curve of a rib, human. And then, carved inside the barrel lid, a name. Ansel Blythe. Holmes whispered it aloud. The name was unfamiliar to Watson, but Holmes stood frozen for a long moment. His hands clenched. "Holmes?" Watson said, uneasy. "Do you know him?" "No," Holmes answered, but his voice was heavy. But someone wanted him forgotten. They searched the cellar further and found, behind a false panel, a small compartment. A ledger was tucked inside, wrapped in oilskin. Holmes opened it. The pages were filled with dates, numbers, and notations in tight, slanted script. But in the margin of one page was something else, a sketch. It was a face. Hollow-eyed. Gaunt. Its mouth twisted in a scream or a smile, it was hard to tell. And beneath it, written in red pencil. "Do not dig up what should stay buried." Holmes exhaled slowly. "They tried to erase him," he said. But he clawed his way back through memory, through rumor, through death. That's why this case found me. Because some things refuse silence. Watson stared at him. "You believe this, Blythe, was the butcher?" Holmes shook his head. "I believe he was the first." The following hours were a blur of quiet investigation. Holmes sent Inspector Lestrade a telegram, instructing him to meet them at the mortuary with the ledger. Meanwhile, he arranged to have the bones sent under police guard. But the mystery thickened. At Scotland Yard, Lestrade looked grim as he turned the pages of the ledger. "We found another one," he said. "A body. Same ritual cuts. Same wrapping. Found near Clerkenwell. The name written nearby?" He paused. "Margaret Blythe." Holmes closed his eyes. Brother and sister. Forgotten. Buried. Brought up only through blood. That night, Holmes returned to his flat, but sleep evaded him. He sat by the fire with the ledger in hand, tracing the ink like a blind man reading Braille. Something in it gnawed at him. A pattern. A message. Then he saw it. Every fifth entry. A letter. First it looked random, but as he transcribed it, a phrase emerged. Bell Lane hides its heart in the hollow of the butcher's blade. He stood at once. There was more to the house. More than the cellar. More than the bones. He had missed something. And the clock was ticking. Elsewhere, under the waxy yellow glow of a street lamp, a man in a butcher's apron moved through the fog. His boots were wet with cellar water. His hands smelled of soap and copper. And on his lips, a tune hummed softly. Hush now, hush, the blade is near. It sings of meat and whispered fear. He disappeared into the alley, whistling. Unseen. Unnamed. But not for long. Not with Holmes hunting him. Not with the past clawing up through the cellar floor. Not with the dead whispering in the dark. There are streets in London that bear the charm of fading history, cobblestones chipped by the years, windows dimmed by the fog of time. But Bell Lane was not charming. It was a gnarled corridor of the forgotten, a vein once pulsing with life, now thinned by years of silence. Yet in that silence, Holmes believed, something ancient still stirred, perhaps not in flesh, but in ink. Holmes and Inspector Lestrade returned the next morning to the butcher's cellar, armed not with lanterns and suspicion, but with gloves and dust brushes. The cellar's fetid air had settled into their lungs the day before, but now, they entered it like scholars in a ruin. They combed through crates of rusted cleavers and mildewed ledgers, searching not for flesh, but for names, transactions, evidence, something left behind. You believe the motive lies not in the murders themselves, Lestrade mused as Holmes examined a lockbox wedged into the back of a decaying shelf, but in the butcher's books? Holmes did not look up. Murder is but the consequence. The ledger is the cause. And there it was, a brittle, leather-bound book, locked and stained with time. Holmes pried it open with the slender blade of his pocket-knife. The pages inside whispered age, but the ink was legible. It wasn't just a record of meat sales. It was a ledger of names, some crossed out, others underlined. Addresses beside them. Next to certain entries, obscure phrases. She knew. Paid in full. Sent to warehouse. And others marked with a chilling X. Lestrade leaned in. These aren't customers. No, Holmes said quietly. They're victims. Or conspirators. Or both. But one name, written thrice and underlined with an almost obsessive hand, stood out, Jonas Fairchild. He was marked with a circle. The date beside it read, November 1889. The same month the murders ceased. Fairchild's address was still visible, 42 Narrow Street, Limehouse. Holmes closed the book slowly. We go to Limehouse, he said. Immediately. Limehouse, that crooked port of immigrants, lantern-lit taverns, and whispered deals, greeted them with its usual perfume of sea brine and soot. But 42 Narrow Street was not a dockside hovel. It was a modest brick dwelling with ivy clawing its walls. When they knocked, there was no answer. Lestrade looked to Holmes, who had already circled to the rear. A woman stood in the garden, trimming dead leaves from a small, stunted rosebush. Her face was lined with time but hardened by something more than age. Mrs. Fairchild? Holmes asked gently. She did not flinch. I was. I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Inspector Lestrade. We're investigating matters concerning Bell Lane, and your husband. The pruning shears stopped mid-snip. He's dead, she said plainly. When did he pass? November 1889. The exact date in the ledger. How did he die? Lestrade asked. Her hands trembled, the first sign of vulnerability. Burned. In the warehouse fire. The one no one talks about. The one that took 23 souls but earned no headline. Lestrade's brows furrowed. A fire? I don't recall. Because they buried it, she snapped. The papers. The police. The city. Jonas worked in a cold storage facility. Not meat. Something worse. That fire was no accident. That warehouse held secrets. My husband told me things, late at night, when the drink was heavy in him and he wanted to speak before he choked. Holmes leaned forward. What things? She eyed him, trying to decide whether truth was safer than silence. There were shipments. Not just flesh. Not just bone. People. The poor. Orphans. Immigrants without names. Brought in by wagons from the East End. Disappearances no one questioned. Lestrade's face drained of color. Human trafficking. No, she said. Not quite. Trafficking requires the victim to live. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mrs. Fairchild wiped her hands on her apron. He said there was a man. A man who ran it all. Jonas called him the slaughterman. Said he wore butcher's boots and smelled like camphor. But his hands were soft. Like a doctor's. She looked down at the rosebush, its thorns stripped and stems trembling. The week before he died, Jonas was shaking in his sleep. He said he'd written it all down, in a letter he meant to send to the Times. He never posted it. Where is it? Holmes asked. She pointed inside the house. They found the letter in a locked tin beneath the floorboards. It was dated November 11, 1889, 3 days before the fire. It was addressed to the editor, The Times of London, and began with a chilling line. If you read this, I am likely ash or buried. But know this, what lies beneath Bell Lane is older than the butcher's block. It is a trade in silence, soaked in blood. I have seen the eyes of the man they call the slaughterman. And he has no soul. The letter detailed transport routes from the docks to the old slaughterhouse, payments from unnamed patrons, and code words used to refer to different victims. It was less confession and more a plea, not for forgiveness, but for exposure. But the last page was missing. Torn. Ripped cleanly, as if someone had taken it before the rest was sealed away. Holmes stared into the floorboards, then at the hearth nearby. The final page, he murmured, was likely burned. Someone found it before she did. Someone who wanted it erased. Lestrade turned the letter over in his hands. You think the man still lives? Holmes stood. If he's alive, he's watching. And if he's watching, he'll soon know we're watching him. There was no more time to speculate. Holmes and Lestrade stepped into the fading light of Limehouse, where fog curled low over the cobbles like a warning. The sun was dying on the day, and with it came a silence that felt less like peace and more like breath being held. But the final revelation of that night came not from letters, nor ledgers, but from a constable who intercepted them at Baker Street later that evening. "Sir," he said, pale-faced, hat in hand. "You asked us to post a watch on Bell Lane's old slaughterhouse." "Yes?" Holmes replied. "They're gone. Both of them. The watchman. Vanished." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "And what remains?" The constable swallowed. "Blood, sir. A fresh trail of it. Leading inside." And with that, the shadows lengthened once more across London's map, reaching toward Bell Lane, as if the city itself was pointing with a trembling hand, whispering, "Look closer." The fog did not lift with the dawn. It clung like a secret over Bell Lane, thick and stubborn, refusing to yield even to the rising sun's persistence. Horse hooves clattered faintly in the distance. Somewhere, a bread cart creaked, and chimney smoke drifted up like ghostly prayers into the murky sky. But Holmes was already awake, fully dressed, and perched in a bow-backed chair by the window of our modest lodgings above the local inn. His fingers tapped against his knee, rhythmic as a metronome. He had not spoken a word since the previous night's revelation, the torn cloth, the trapdoor, the initials etched beneath old floorboards. I rose and stirred the fire. The embers hissed softly. I asked, with some weariness in my voice, "Do you believe we're being watched, Holmes?" He turned his head slowly, eyes still locked on the street below. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "we are not only being watched. We are being measured. Observed as one does game before the hunt." Before I could question further, a knock sounded, a short, abrupt rap at the door. Holmes moved swiftly. He opened it to find Mrs. Murchison, the innkeeper, standing with a folded slip of parchment and an uneasy frown. "It was slid under the door downstairs, Mr. Holmes," she whispered. "No one saw who delivered it." Holmes thanked her, closed the door, and unfolded the note. Black ink. Elegant, even strokes. No signature. "Do not trust the baker with soft hands. Flour covers more than bread. Tonight. St. Griselda's. Midnight." We exchanged glances. "The baker?" I asked. "Harold Clem? He's the one who found the first body, isn't he?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes. And now it seems the noose of suspicion tightens around him." Harold Clem's shop, Clem's Hearth and Crust, stood on the corner of Bell Lane and Withering Square. It was a cheerful little place on the outside, blue shutters, golden sign, the smell of yeast and cinnamon filling the air. But Holmes entered with a cold efficiency that made even the warmth of the ovens feel hollow. Clem himself was behind the counter, dusting a tray of loaves. He was tall and soft-featured, with gentle eyes and a baker's belly. His hands, however, were what drew Holmes' gaze, pale, powdery, and unscarred. "Mr. Clem," Holmes began, "I'd like to see your ledger." The man blinked. "Ledger, sir?" "Yes. The one you use to note deliveries, flour shipments, staff wages, and hours of work." Well, I suppose, certainly. Though, if I may ask, what is this about?" Holmes smiled politely but said nothing. Clem fetched a thick, cloth-bound book from beneath the counter. Holmes leafed through it, page by page, lips pursed. Then, he stopped. Tapped a finger. The entry for the week of September 12 had a conspicuous blank, no delivery recorded for the 14th. And yet, according to the receipt found earlier in a police report, Clem had indeed received a flour shipment that day. A rather large one. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "You omitted this delivery." "Why?" Clem's brow furrowed. "I didn't notice. I must have forgotten." "But you didn't forget any other entry for the entire month?" "Not one missed. Except this." Clem began to stammer, then caught himself. I don't have an explanation." Holmes closed the ledger. "Let me try one. You didn't receive flour that morning. You received something else. Or rather, someone. And you were paid, not in coin, but in silence." The baker paled. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Holmes stepped closer. "Who brought the package, Mr. Clem?" Clem shook his head. I didn't see." "But you knew. Didn't you?" Tears welled in Clem's eyes. "They threatened my daughter," he whispered. Yes, I took the crate into the cellar." I didn't open it. I swear. But I knew it weren't flour. I knew it. Holmes' face did not soften. And the cloth? Clem shuddered. I burned it. A man came back the next night to retrieve the crate. I heard it scraping. Then it was gone. But he left a torn piece behind. I buried it in the trash, prayed it'd be over. But of course, it wasn't over. That scrap found in the alley was what led Holmes to the cellar in the first place. Clem collapsed into a chair, breathing hard. Holmes turned to me. We have a courier, Watson. A baker pressed into service, not by greed, but fear. And now, perhaps, we shall learn the destination. Midnight arrived like a shadow wearing a robe of silence. We stood at the gates of St. Griselda's Church, the only building on Bell Lane older than memory itself. The note had said to come at midnight. So we did. The doors groaned open with effort. Dust danced in the lantern light. The pews were decayed, the altar broken. Ivy crept through stained glass like the fingers of a forgotten god. Holmes stepped inside first. We moved toward the back. There was a faint sound, metal on stone. Then a voice, so soft it could have been the wind. You came. A figure stood beneath the shattered arch, cloaked. Hooded. Face obscured. Holmes held up a hand, motioning me to stay still. The voice continued. I told you about the baker. He's not the only one they've used. There are more. Tradesmen. Gravediggers. Midwives. They've all been touched by the same coin. Who are you? Holmes asked. The figure turned slightly. Someone who tried to speak, once. And was silenced with the screams of her sister. There was pain in that voice. Trembling, like brittle ice. She tossed a folded paper at Holmes' feet. Then turned and vanished behind the chapel ruins before we could give chase. Holmes unfolded the paper. On it, a crude map of Bell Lane, and 3 red crosses. One here, he said, pointing. The butcher's shop. He tapped again. The bakery. And finally, his finger paused on the last red cross. The cemetery. The following day was bright, but it didn't feel like it. The sky remained the color of tin. Holmes paced back and forth in the graveyard, scanning names. He stopped beside a half-sunken headstone, blank, unmarked. Then, without warning, he knelt and drove his cane into the ground beside it. The cane struck something solid. Hollow. Together, we began to dig with spades. The soil was wet and cloying, as if it didn't want to give up its secret. But it did. A wooden box emerged, roughly the size of a small casket. Inside, bones. But not human. A pig's skull. And beneath it, another torn scrap of cloth. This time, not red, but black. With stitching that bore a family crest. Holmes studied it silently. Then he whispered, "This is no longer just a butcher's tale, Watson. This is a matter of legacy." And with that, the game twisted again. For someone was not just hiding bodies. They were hiding bloodlines. And the butcher, it seemed, had not been forgotten by all. Bell Lane had always been a street with secrets. But some secrets, buried deep beneath cobblestone and conscience, were never meant to be unearthed. And yet, with every passing day, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson found themselves peeling back layers of dust, guilt, and decay that the city had long chosen to forget. The morning after the confrontation at Widow Penelope's, a thick fog hung over London like a morning veil. The streets whispered in low tones. Even the usual cause of crows on the rooftops seemed subdued. Holmes, hat tilted forward, eyes sharp as razors, had already begun walking briskly toward a small but notorious establishment nestled between two shuttered bookshops, a defunct butcher's shop that once belonged to the Maddox family. Its sign, faded and cracked, still bore the words, Maddox and Sons, purveyors of the finest cuts. Now it was merely a carcass of its former self. The paint peeled like dead skin, and the windows, boarded up with rusted nails, moaned each time the wind whispered through. "I must say, Holmes," said Watson, coughing as the smell of mold and age hit him, "this place looks more like a tomb than a shop." "Precisely," murmured Holmes, producing a set of slender tools from the inner lining of his coat. "And like most tombs, Watson, it's built to guard something the living were never meant to disturb." Holmes pried open the door's lock with surprising ease. Inside, the gloom swallowed them whole. Dust curled in the air like phantom breath. The room reeked of forgotten years, iron, fat, mildew, and something fainter, something like regret. The counter still stood, though it leaned to one side like a man weary of carrying a burden too long. Behind it, old meat hooks dangled from the ceiling like skeletal fingers, casting grim shadows. Cold storage doors hung open, their insides gutted and silent. Holmes's eyes swept the place like a lantern. "We're not here for meat, Watson. We're here for records." And with that, he descended into the cellar. The wooden steps creaked ominously beneath their weight, but they held. At the base, lit by a single oil lamp Holmes had brought along, they found the accounting desk. It was covered in dust, spiderwebs, and a few rat droppings. Watson winced, but Holmes brushed everything aside with clinical precision. He began rifling through the drawers, ledgers, invoices, scraps of paper. "These records go back decades," Watson observed. "Yes," Holmes nodded. "And I'm searching for a very particular window of time. The weeks leading to Harold Maddox's disappearance." One ledger stood out, its spine cracked, its leather binding marked with faint crimson fingerprints. Holmes opened it to a page marked with a torn slip of linen. The entries were dated 10 years prior, tallies of meat purchased, customers served. But there was something odd. "Here," Holmes pointed, "look at these entries." Watson leaned in. Lamb shank, pork shoulder, and then, he blinked, puzzled, item 47B. Item 47B. Item 47B, repeated nearly 24 times. "There's no meat named 47B in any butcher's catalog," Holmes said grimly. "But it appears again and again. In increasing quantity." The last entry, dated 3 days before Harold vanished. Watson frowned. "You think this code hides something?" "I'm quite certain of it." Holmes turned the page, and froze. Inside was a loose scrap of thick parchment. On it, written in ink as dark as midnight, was a single list. Names. All of them crossed out except one. The list. Francis Delaney. Evelyn Kemp. Alfred Rooks. James Godfrey. Edwin Tillman. Inspector Randall Meeks. Harold Maddox. Thomas Elridge, not crossed out. Watson felt the chill first. "My God," he whispered. "Those are the names of the Bell Lane victims, even the inspector." Holmes nodded. "And only one remains unchecked. Thomas Elridge." Back above ground, Holmes handed the list to a messenger boy with strict instructions: deliver it to Lestrade, and do not breathe a word to anyone else. Watson, meanwhile, paced. So Maddox was keeping track of the victims? Or he was being forced to, Holmes countered. These names were not for slaughter. They were offerings. Witnesses, perhaps. Each one tied to something that happened here 10 years ago. Watson's voice dropped. And the ledger entries. 47b. Could that be the code for bodies? Holmes looked solemn. Or for silence. By evening, they tracked down Thomas Elridge, a retired schoolteacher who had relocated to the outskirts of London. The man lived modestly, in a creaking manor home surrounded by frostbitten roses and time-worn hedges. Elridge answered the door with eyes like dusty porcelain and a voice brittle with memory. "I knew someone would come someday," he said without preamble. "You're here about Bell Lane, about the butcher." Inside, by a crackling fireplace, Elridge poured them tea with shaking hands. Holmes studied the man, noting the tremor, the hollow under his eyes, the nervous flick of his fingers. "I taught Harold Maddox," Elridge said. "And I taught his brother, Graham." Watson blinked. "Brother?" Elridge nodded. "Graham Maddox. Few knew of him. He was the secret child, born to the family in scandal. They kept him hidden for years, a twisted, violent boy. Had a mind for pain. I saw it even then." He paused, then added, "Harold tried to protect him. Always covering up the outbursts. The dead animals. The disappearances. Until the day the shop caught fire and Harold vanished." Watson leaned in. "Do you believe Graham killed him?" Elridge swallowed hard. "I know he did. But I couldn't prove it. No one could. And now he's back," Holmes said darkly. "Hiding behind butchers' hooks and shadows." Elridge nodded. "And I'm the last name." Outside, the wind howled like a dying thing. Holmes and Watson departed in haste, knowing now that the murders were no random spree. They were retributions. Clean up. A decade of suppressed truths now surfacing like bloated corpses in a canal. And Graham Maddox, the forgotten butcher of Bell Lane, was still very much alive. But if he was, he would not remain forgotten for much longer. Not if Sherlock Holmes had anything to say about it. There are streets in London that seem to hum with memory. Bell Lane was not one of them. It whispered. Whispered in cobbled voices and soot-choked sighs. But on this night, something stirred deeper than mere whispers. Something beneath the floorboards. When dawn crept through the shutters of 221B Baker Street, the morning held no peace. Holmes sat silently at the edge of his chair, his fingers steeped in thought beneath his chin, eyes closed, not in slumber, but in calculation. The previous evening's findings had disturbed him more than he let on, yet it was in silence where his mind often reached its most dangerous conclusions. Watson had barely finished dressing when Holmes opened his eyes and announced, "We missed something last night, Watson. Something not in the visible world, but beneath it." Watson paused, brushing lint from his waistcoat. "You mean the cellar at Alcott's?" "We already searched." "No," Holmes cut in, standing briskly. "Not Alcott's. The butcher's shop. The original one. The one that used to stand where the bakery now resides." Watson blinked. "But that building was destroyed in a fire years ago." "Exactly," Holmes said, retrieving his coat. "Which means anything beneath it might still be untouched." They arrived on Bell Lane as the town was just stretching its limbs. The morning fog still clung to the gutters. The bakery stood innocently enough, its facade a fresh coat of pale blue and white. But Holmes wasn't interested in pastries. He asked no permission. With the suddenness of a crow's flight, he moved toward the rear, where remnants of the old butcher's shop still lingered, a worn brick foundation, and a small rusted cellar door half hidden beneath a pile of discarded wood. Holmes yanked it open with a groan of rusted hinges. The air that spilled out was ancient. It smelled of ash, rotted brine, and something darker, regret, perhaps. Watson hesitated, but Holmes had already begun his descent into the shadows below. The stairs were steep and uneven. The lantern in Holmes' hand illuminated a narrow tunnel, chiseled crudely into the earth, an afterthought to the original construction. The air grew colder as they walked. Then came the sound. Subtle at first, like wind in a pipe. But it wasn't wind. Footsteps. Not theirs. Holmes halted, hand raised. The sound stopped, too. "Who's there?" Watson called, but no answer came. Only silence, and the feeling that they were being watched. The tunnel ended in a small chamber. It was no more than a dozen feet wide, the walls still bearing black stains from fire. At the center stood an iron table, half melted at one edge. Tools lay scattered around it, cleavers, hooks, and something Holmes recognized immediately as a bone saw of antique make. But it was the walls that caught his attention most. They were marked. Hundreds of carvings. Names. Some scratched deeply. Others barely legible. But among them, in chilling uniformity, they noticed a pattern. The same surname appeared again and again. Alcott. Watson stepped closer, squinting at one of the names. Bertram Alcott, born 1803. Another, Cecily Alcott. 1829. And beneath it, Ernest Alcott. 1861. Holmes stared in silence. "These are not just names," he murmured. "They're family. Generations of them." "Victims?" Watson asked. "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Or perpetrators." They left the chamber in thoughtful silence, the weight of history pressing upon them. Above ground, Holmes didn't speak for several streets. Not until they reached an old records office near Bishopsgate. There, he dove into dusty ledgers like a man trying to unearth a ghost. He discovered something rather unsettling. In the late 1700s, the original Alcott patriarch, Thomas Alcott, was tried in secret for a series of murders committed under the guise of medical research. He had been a butcher by trade, and a self-proclaimed healer by delusion. But his obsession had descended into horror. He believed that the soul could be measured by the density of flesh, and that certain cuts of the human body, properly preserved, could allow communion with the dead. He was sentenced to death, but escaped before the execution. The ledgers ended there. But Holmes knew better. He traced each successive generation of Alcotts. Each had a dark mark on their record: mysterious disappearances, unusual interests, premature deaths. All subtle. All unexplained. A lineage steeped in blood. And so the butcher of Bell Lane was not a man. It was a legacy. Each generation bearing its own secret torch, passed in shadow, waiting for the next to lift the blade. That very night, Holmes and Watson returned once more to the bakery. With permission secured through Lestrade, they began a proper excavation of the cellar floor. What they found there silenced the room. Buried beneath the flagstones were bones. Dozens of them. Children, women, men, each arranged in ceremonial fashion. Bones bleached and stacked as if on display for a gallery only the deranged could admire. Watson could barely speak. Good God! Holmes stood motionless, his face hard as stone. The butcher was never forgotten, he said. They simply changed the lock on his door. But the question remained, who was the last to carry the torch? There were no more known Alcotts in London. No registered descendants. No heirs. Unless the name had been changed. Holmes returned to his notebook. The strange girl, Elsie, the one who whispered to Watson and vanished in the alley. The pale man with trembling fingers in the apothecary. The bakery owner who avoided eye contact. Someone on Bell Lane had blood not just on their hands, but in their very veins. That night, Holmes did not return to Baker Street. He remained alone in Bell Lane, shrouded by fog and his own suspicions. He watched the windows, counted the chimneys, measured shadows. And then, at precisely 3:12 in the morning, a light flickered on in the bakery. It stayed on for 17 minutes. And in that time, a figure, hooded, slight, emerged from the back and disappeared into the alley where no door should exist. Holmes followed. The alley narrowed into nothing. But on the right wall, there was a seam, a false brick, cleverly crafted. Holmes pressed his palm against it. It gave way. And behind it, a narrow staircase descended. He did not hesitate. For the first time since this mystery began, Sherlock Holmes felt the tingle of danger not as an observer, but as its intended guest. The days in London had grown colder, not merely in temperature, but in temperament. Grey skies smothered the rooftops. Rain clung to windows like unanswered questions. And down in the depths of Bell Lane, where puddles collected secrets and lamplight cast twisted shadows, the case was winding like a noose. Holmes, silent as a closed book, studied the tattered map Miss Whitlow had retrieved from her attic, an old blueprint of the lane, drawn decades ago. It was etched with peculiar notations in a hand that shook with either age or guilt. Tiny red X's marked seemingly random spots along Bell Lane, a blacksmith's shop now long gone, a coal chute behind the butcher's, a sealed cellar beneath an apothecary. The map was not of the street, but of its hidden life. Watson sat near the hearth, nursing a small burn from a rushed chemical experiment earlier that morning. His eyes, though tired, were alert. He watched Holmes with a growing sense of concern. "There's a pattern," Holmes murmured, finger tracing a line from one red X to the next. "Not one of geography, but of memory." Watson blinked. "Memory?" Holmes nodded, then turned. "What if the map is not simply a record of places, but of wounds? Someone has walked these steps, revisiting sites tied not to crime, but to pain." Watson stood. "Then it's a ledger of ghosts." "Precisely." But just as clarity was blooming in the air between them, a knock at the door fractured the stillness. It was brisk, uncertain, a fluttering heartbeat upon the wood. Mrs. Hudson announced the visitor with a tremor in her voice. "It's Mr. Colin Sheldrake, sirs, from the Museum of Anatomy." That name hung heavy. Sheldrake, the reclusive scholar with an unusual obsession for Victorian surgical tools and early forensic science. He had written to Holmes once, a year ago, about bones found beneath the old meat-packing facility near Spitalfields. Bones that bore the marks of unnatural study. He entered with the air of a man who had walked too long with silence as company. Tall, gaunt, wearing gloves though it wasn't the cold that required them. He held in his hand a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. "I'm told," Sheldrake began, "you're searching for the butcher, though I fear what you seek has been long buried, not just in earth, but in apathy." Holmes motioned to the chair. "Speak plainly, Mr. Sheldrake." The man set the parcel down, unwrapped it, and revealed a leather-bound journal, water-damaged, ink-faded. "This," he said, "was recovered from beneath the Bell Lane Chapel during renovations. It belonged to a gravedigger named Elric Rowan. It contains details of burials that were unofficial. Ones the parish never approved. No headstones. No names." Watson opened the first pages. They were filled with sketches, faces disfigured, limbs rearranged in eerie geometries. Dates. Ages. Some no older than 12. Holmes leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Why was this hidden? Sheldrake's voice caught. "Because Rowan confessed, he didn't bury the bodies. he relocated them. They were already dead, or nearly so. Brought to him by a man he never named. Paid in coin and fear. The journal ends abruptly. I believe Rowan himself disappeared a week after the final entry. There was a silence, vast and crushing. Then Holmes stood, moving to the window. The man behind all this, he never wanted recognition. He didn't kill for fame. He killed for silence. For removal. He saw flesh as nothing more than a canvas for a message we've yet to translate. Watson spoke softly, a forgotten butcher. But not forgotten to all, Holmes whispered. There was something else in the map now, an intersection where 4 red X's created a cross. That precise place aligned with the journal's final burial. Bell Lane's narrowest alley. Sheldrake added, there are rumors of an underground vault beneath that alley. Sealed in the 1840s. No official records. But the builders mentioned a room with hooks and drains. Watson stiffened. Like a slaughterhouse. Like a confession chamber, Holmes corrected grimly. They knew where to go next. But they also knew what it might cost. Night fell like ink spilled across vellum. The alley awaited, narrow and forgotten, flanked by buildings that seemed to lean inward with age. As they descended the crumbling steps hidden behind the butcher's former quarters, the air grew dense. The stone beneath their feet was damp, hungry. The final confrontation lay below. Not with a man, perhaps. But with an idea, a cruelty preserved by time and shadows. The butcher was never after blood alone. He was carving his philosophy into history. And now, it had come full circle. But before Holmes could speak further, his hand brushed against a small metal latch hidden in the floor's corner. It clicked. And the stone beneath them began to open. What lay beneath had been sealed for over 40 years. Yet the stench of it was immediate. And it was not just the past that greeted them. It was something, waiting. Awaiting the right eyes. Awaiting the name it once feared. Awaiting Sherlock Holmes. It was not a storm that loomed over London that morning, but a quietness. A silence so profound it hummed like an empty cathedral. And as Holmes stood in the heart of Bell Lane, he felt the very breath of the city pull back, as though holding its lungs before a final exhale. The whispers of the past had screamed for attention. And now, they would be answered. In the dreary light of daybreak, the path was clear. The clues, like bones buried deep beneath the cobbled skin of the alleyways, had been unearthed, assembled, and pieced together. Holmes, never one for the dramatic unless it served the truth, had called for everyone involved to meet inside the crumbling but still standing butcher's shop. Mrs. Bell, her hands shaking as if a cold had seized her marrow, arrived first. Then came Constable Wren, weary from long nights and weighty with guilt. Even the woman from the boarding house, Miss Eleanor Grace, stood beside them, her eyes haunted by secrets that clung like cobwebs. And last, George Clay, his cane tapping as rhythmically as a guilty heartbeat, entered the threshold of a place that had once smelled of blood and boiling broth. Holmes did not speak at first. He simply circled the center table, where aged stains still told of slaughtered beasts and lives once traded in meat. Watson stood by the window, arms crossed, observing not just the room but the souls within it. When Holmes finally spoke, his voice carried no flair. Only finality. Every story leaves its stain. And this one was butchered long before it began. He turned his gaze to George Clay. You lied, Mr. Clay. About more than the night in question. You said you left the trade. That you never looked back. But the truth is you couldn't look back, because what you saw was her. Clay's fingers clenched the handle of his cane. But he said nothing. Holmes nodded to Mrs. Bell. You called him a ghost from the lane. But he wasn't just a former apprentice, was he? He was family. Your husband's illegitimate son. Hidden, forgotten, discarded like unwanted trimmings. Mrs. Bell's lips parted. Not in denial, but in the gasp of truth finally exposed to air. He came back, Holmes continued, not for inheritance, but for revenge. Not for money, but to remind the world that the butcher of Bell Lane had left more than meat behind. Holmes reached into his coat and unfolded the final page of Mr. Bell's ledger. The one that had been carefully tucked inside the binding. It was not a receipt. It was a confession. A letter, penned in trembling script. To the one I wronged, should you ever find this, know that I remember. I remember your mother's eyes, and how I turned from them. I remember your face, though I told the world it meant nothing. I remember, George. Forgive an old man his sins. Clay's voice cracked for the first time. He left me scraps. Scraps of love. Scraps of name. And you think a letter can stitch what he gutted? You didn't kill him, Holmes said gently. But you led someone else to believe he deserved to die. A silence fell again. Eleanor Grace shifted nervously. Holmes turned to her. Your brother, he said softly. He was the boy taken in by Bell. Apprenticed. Beaten. Shamed. His name was Elijah. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. He came home, one night. Blood on his apron. Silence in his voice. He wouldn't speak of what happened, but I knew. I knew. And then, he vanished. Holmes walked to the rear of the shop. He tapped his cane on the floor. A hollow thud echoed. Watson stepped forward with the constables and pried open the cellar hatch. Beneath the wooden boards lay bones. Small, fragile. Not butchered. Buried. Holmes spoke now not with deduction, but with sorrow. Elijah never left. He died here. Perhaps by accident, perhaps by his own hand. But someone buried him, covered him up, and sealed away the truth. The room stood still. Mrs. Bell began to weep. Loudly. We were afraid. Afraid the scandal would kill us. Afraid people would stop coming. My husband made the call, and I did nothing. Clay stepped forward slowly. You let my brother rot. His voice wasn't angry. It was hollow. So I made them remember. The notes, the symbols, the butcher's cleaver. I made the ghosts howl. Holmes placed a hand on the man's shoulder. But you forgot one thing, George. The dead do not scream for vengeance. Only the living do. And now, what will you do with your life? 2 weeks passed. The papers wrote of Bell Lane with a hunger. Bones beneath the butcher's block. Holmes uncovers long-forgotten family feud. But the truth, as it often does, was more delicate than ink could hold. Elijah was given a burial. Not in grandeur, but in peace. The city, it seemed, had room for even forgotten sons. Mrs. Bell left London quietly, her reputation in ruins. George Clay did not return to the shop. Instead, he left a note on the door. Some cuts never heal. But silence feeds ghosts. Let them rest now. Holmes and Watson walked together one final time down Bell Lane, the summer wind washing the street clean. Do you believe he forgives them? Watson asked. No, Holmes said. But perhaps he forgives himself. And that is the first cut that must be mended. They turned the corner and disappeared into the rhythm of Baker Street. The butcher's bell rang no more. And at last, Bell Lane was silent. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. In the quiet places of memory, some voices still wait to be heard. Some stories demand more than solving, they ask for remembrance. And so I ask you, would you have arrested Eleanor Blythe, or listened a moment longer to the pain behind the blade? Let me know in the comments.